In this series, we're going to talk about the creative impulse. So essentially, all humans are wired to create. And like most things, it's a sliding scale spectrum. Some people have very little interest. Others are obsessed and addicted to creating. And I would say those of us that are artists and designers are on the right hand of the spectrum towards obsessed. And so it's our nature. We want to design. And so um, we're going to talk about and focus in this lecture series on what that means and how do we use that urge and that need to turn it into a career path. The painter Eugene Delacroix had this advice for young artists looking for ideas. Everything is a subject. Yourself, your impressions, your emotions in the presence of nature. And you all have heard me say this, and you will hear me say it again. Because the reality is that it takes hearing things about 6 times before they stick. So the things that are really, really important, I will repeat, hoping they stick the best. You can only ever be a second-rate someone else. You want to figure out who you are so that you can develop your own style and that you can then find sources of inspiration to use to inspire your work. And we're going to take a look at what I mean by that. So where to look for inspiration? Where do we look when we want to look for inspiration? We observe. We look at the world around us. We look at the world inside of us. There's observation of nature, observation of culture, observation of history, and observation of yourself. So a significant aspect of your education is basically the observation of life and the stuff of life. Okay, so let's talk about these in order. Nature. We are nature, and nature is around us, and we are drawn to the beauty of nature. The Fresh and Impressionists, the painters during that period, this was in a time when there was no internet. And actually I lived in a time that was, but they didn't have the technology that we have today. So they took their easels outside and they painted very quickly. And that's why they were called the Impressionists, because they created these impressions very, very, very quickly on canvas. And, it focused almost primarily on nature and the beauty of nature. And as a result, Claude Monet here, very, very beautiful impressionistic painting by Mr. Monet. Most of you all have seen the cave paintings or other types of Paleolithic drawings that were done by our ancestors. Often they represented animals or they represented humans. Sometimes they represented dreams. Really, really interesting paintings, and they are the oldest examples we have of humans creating art. And so after a period known as the Enlightenment, our society began to move away from farming. That's what agrarian talks about, the agrarian life. We started to move away from farming, and we started to move into cities and towns. And as we moved away from that natural environment, we began to turn our dwellings into works of art. Artists began looking to nature still, though, right? So we had left nature, humans left nature and started landscaping our own environments, our own habitats. But despite the fact that we did that, we still craved nature. And so we pulled that into our design, our buildings and our cities. And you can see that here this is in Budapest, Hungary. And you can see it has the Fisherman's Bastion. It feels like it's inspired by the sea and sea shapes, things that exist within the sea. And it has that natural feel to it, despite the fact that it is entirely artificial. New Schwanstein Castle literally means new uh, Swan Castle. Is in the Bavarian Alps, and it actually was the source of inspiration for Disney's Cinderella's Castle. And you can see how this, if you think about the Alps in the background covered in snow, you can see how that inspired the home of the king of Bavaria in its context. So artists tend to be fascinated by nature, right? As subject, as inspiration, as medium. Nature can serve as the subject, the source of inspiration, or the media used to create and design art. And you can see there that this skyscraper in Taiwan was partially inspired by the shape of bamboo. You all have an assignment where you are going to use nature to design. And we will talk more about your assignments in separate videos. So here are some other examples. So artists have been inspired by a lot of different things. And here you can see the Barcelona Olympic Pavilion was inspired by a fish. I'm not sure exactly it was a goldfish, but it was inspired by a fish. And it has that fish-like shape. The New Delhi Lotus Temple below is almost a literal interpretation of the lotus flower. And so we still look to nature to inspire our our buildings that we inhabit, despite the fact that we've left nature behind. And so there was a movement that came along because, people we tend to do this. I like to talk about it like a pendulum swing. We swing from one side of the pendulum to the pendulum swings from one side, the left side, to the right side and back and forth. And if you look at all periods of art and architecture, and we'll look at them in more detail, you will see that we tend to go from periods of minimalism to detail, periods of very, very influenced by nature to not influenced at all. And so people get tired of a period and it swings back in the other direction and back and forth. And you will see this throughout the history of art and design and architecture. And so this is just an example of a movement that was called land art. It's also known as earth art. And instead of painting the landscape like the Impressionists did, these artists worked and work, because they are still doing it, outdoors, sculpting the land itself. And here is an example of Richard Long painting with mud. This is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, very, very famous work that he created at the time, in nature, out of nature. And so, as our society has begun to focus on environmental issues such as pollution, global warming, species depletion, a lot of artists have turned to literally using trash. This is also known as it can be called trashing. In my day, it was called found art or found object art, where you just find objects and you use them, you give them a second life by turning them into art. And you all will have an opportunity to do that yourself in this class. And what this does is you're using something that has been discarded and finding a way to turn it into something that is wanted. And so it raises awareness. It creates dialogue. It changes the human behavior and perception towards our environment and what are we doing to it. It makes us look at the long term. And that is something that is part of being an artist, is provoking conversation and provoking people to think beyond the day-to-day. So this is a school of art. The roof is made of grass. And you can go up there and run around, and I have seen them cut this, because as you look over here, there's a car on the right-hand side, and a lawnmower is probably half the size of that. So you could see they could very easily cut this with a lawnmower. That's how they keep it cut. So the Danish architect Jorn Utzon designed the National Opera House in Sydney, and it was inspired by an orange. And you can see there how the segments ended up becoming the form of the opera house. Barry Underwood's artwork on the left-hand side, and Nils Udo on the right side. And again, this is, these are all works of art that are inspired by nature. And you're probably wondering, why am I showing you art? And it goes back to the fact that I studied architecture as a fine art. And so for me, architecture is sculpture. It's inextricable from what we're looking at here. It's inextricable from painting. It's inextricable from land art, from graphic design, from film. It's just a different form and a different expression. And in our case, what we design, our works of art, are functional, and whereas these are not. Although I guess, a giant bird found that, it would be very happy about that nest. But how these are meant to be non-functional. So we're doing functional art, but they're still connected in the sense that they all apply the principles and elements of design. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here and continue in the next.